I'll never forget that long drive north in the summer of 2007. Born on December 19th, 1986, I had just turned 20 years old that previous winter. My name is Christina Kaleka, and I grew up in Canada as the only daughter of divorced Filipino migrants, Elizabeth and Mario Kaleka. Like many Filipinos, I had a devoutly Catholic upbringing. Friends and family described me as hardworking and a natural leader, with ambitions of attending Teachers College at Toronto's York University. At 5'2" and 125 pounds, I kept in shape by playing volleyball, though I would only occasionally try jogging. The heat that August was oppressive, making the air conditioning in my car work overtime as we drove north from Toronto. Just before the civic holiday, I had originally planned to take part in a youth conference in Montreal, but something made me change my mind at the last minute. Instead, I chose a hiking trip to Ontario's Rainbow Falls Provincial Park. My 20-year-old cousin Faith Castulo sat beside me in the passenger seat, while our two friends Eddie Miga and Joe Benedict dozed in the back. The highway stretched endlessly before us, cutting through dense forests that seemed to press in from both sides. Every now and then we'd pass a logging truck thundering south, its headlights briefly illuminating the growing darkness as evening approached. The radio crackled with static between stations, leaving us in an uncomfortable silence broken only by the hum of tires on asphalt. Rainbow Falls Provincial Park covers an area of about 2 square miles, located on Highway 17 between the towns of Schreiber and Rossport. I had studied the park maps extensively before our trip. There are 2 main camping areas within its boundaries: the primary White Sand Lake site, just a few hundred meters from the park's entrance, and the smaller Rossport site, 3 kilometers to the west, not far from the Trans-Canada Highway. The research I'd done showed that the vast majority of hiking trails in the park are relatively easy, averaging between 3 and 5 kilometers. The only exception is the Casks Isles Trail, a whopping 32 miles long that runs through the park from Rossport all the way to Terrace Bay. Step off the trails into Rainbow Falls, and according to what I'd read, you'll encounter what some have described as the most rugged terrain in the province. We arrived at the park just after noon on Sunday, August 5th, 2007. I had been at the wheel for the entire 14-hour drive from Toronto, and after completing what had turned into a 2-day journey with an overnight stop at a roadside motel, we were all exhausted. My hands were stiff from gripping the steering wheel, and my eyes burned from the constant focus on the road. The entrance to the park seemed almost unremarkable, just a simple wooden sign and a narrow road leading into the trees. But as we drove deeper into the park, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees here were different from those near Toronto, older, taller, their branches creating a canopy so thick that it blocked out most of the afternoon sun. We found our designated spot at Lot 88 of the White Sand Lake campsite. The area was packed with families and groups enjoying the holiday weekend. Children ran between the campsites, their laughter echoing across the lake. The smell of barbecue grills and campfire smoke filled the air. It should have felt welcoming, but something about the density of the surrounding forest made me feel uneasy. Setting up camp took longer than expected. Our hands fumbled with tent poles and stakes, exhaustion making simple tasks difficult. The neighboring campers were friendly enough. A family from Thunder Bay on one side, a group of college students from Winnipeg on the other. We exchanged the usual pleasantries about the weather and our respective journeys, but I found myself distracted, constantly looking toward the tree line. White Sand Lake was indeed very busy that weekend, with only a handful of lots left unoccupied. The constant activity should have been reassuring, but as the afternoon wore on, I noticed how quickly sounds seemed to disappear once they entered the forest. A child's shout would carry clearly across the campground, then vanish abruptly at the edge of the trees, as if the forest itself was swallowing the noise. What was intended to be a half-hour rest turned into a 4-hour deep slumber. We all collapsed in our tents, the exhaustion from our journey finally catching up with us. I remember lying on my sleeping bag, listening to the muffled sounds of the campground through the thin tent walls. Gradually, those sounds faded as I drifted off, replaced by the steady breathing of my companions and the distant lapping of water against the shore. I woke around 10:30 p.m. to find the campground transformed. The family atmosphere had shifted to something more subdued. Most of the children had been put to bed, and small groups of adults sat around campfires, their voices low and conversational. We emerged from our tents groggy and disoriented, the long nap having disrupted our sense of time. We made a small campfire, the wood crackling and sending sparks up into the darkness. The flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, creating shapes that seemed to move independently of the fire's rhythm. We prepared a simple dinner, sandwiches and instant noodles, and passed around a bottle of wine that Joe had brought. The alcohol was minimal, just enough to take the edge off our travel weariness. As we sat around the fire, Eddie told stories about his previous camping trips, trying to lighten the mood, but I found myself constantly distracted by the forest behind us. The trees seemed impossibly tall in the darkness, their tops disappearing into the night sky. Every now and then I would hear something, a branch breaking, leaves rustling, that didn't quite match the rhythm of the wind. Faith noticed my distraction. "You okay?" she asked, touching my arm gently. "Just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. But the truth was, something felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but off. Like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Around 3:30 a.m., exhaustion finally won over unease, and we decided to head back to our tents. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I remember zipping up my tent and lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of my friends settling in for the night. Within 30 minutes, their breathing had deepened into sleep, but I remained awake, staring at the tent ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness beyond. 3 hours later, at 6:30 a.m., I found myself fully awake, my body vibrating with an inexplicable energy. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the tent fabric, casting everything in a pale green glow. I could hear birds beginning their morning songs, but they sounded distant, muted, as if coming from very far away. I crawled out of my tent and stood in the cool morning air. A thick mist had rolled in from the lake, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet. The other tents in our campsite were just dark shapes in the fog. Everything was quiet, except for the occasional drip of dew from the tree branches. I walked over to Eddie's tent and gently shook it. "Eddie," I whispered, not wanting to wake the others. "Want to go for that run?" He emerged a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes. "Now, it's barely light out." "Perfect time," I said, "before it gets too hot." We made our way to the communal shower facilities, our footsteps muffled by the damp ground. The shower building was a simple concrete structure, utilitarian and cold. The fluorescent lights inside flickered intermittently, casting harsh shadows. As I stood under the lukewarm water, I noticed how the sound echoed off the walls, creating an almost musical quality that was both beautiful and unnerving. After washing and changing into our running gear, we stood at the edge of the campground, looking at the trail entrance. The mist had thickened, if anything, turning the forest into a wall of gray-green shadows. The trail disappeared into it after just a few yards, like a tunnel into another world. "Maybe we should wait for better visibility," Eddie suggested, but I was already moving, drawn by something I couldn't explain. The need to run, to move, to explore was overwhelming. We ran together for about 30 minutes, our feet pounding steadily on the packed earth of the trail. The mist created an isolated bubble around us, muffling sound and limiting our vision to just a few yards ahead. Trees would materialize out of the fog like sentinels, then disappear behind us just as quickly. Our breathing was synchronized, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the forest's own heartbeat. As we ran, I noticed things that hadn't been visible from the campground. Strange markings on some of the trees. Not quite natural, but not clearly man-made either. Patches of forest floor where nothing grew. Perfect circles of bare earth surrounded by lush vegetation. The way certain trees seemed to lean away from the trail, as if repelled by human presence. My legs began to burn with fatigue sooner than expected. The 2-day drive had taken more out of me than I'd realized. Each step became an effort, my breathing growing ragged. Eddie, always the more experienced runner, barely seemed winded. We reached an intersection near the park entrance. The signpost stood there, its arrows pointing in different directions. One toward Highway 17, another toward Rainbow Falls, a third back to the campground. The mist swirled around the post, making the letters on the sign seem to shift and blur. "I'm going to check out the waterfall," I said, trying to catch my breath. "You go ahead on the longer trail." Eddie looked uncertain. "You sure? I can come with you." "No, go ahead. I'll be fine. I'll meet you back at camp." He hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded and continued jogging toward the highway trail. I watched him disappear into the mist, the sound of his footfalls fading until I was alone with just the sound of my own breathing and the drip of condensation from the trees. I turned toward the Rainbow Falls Trail. The path here was narrower, more overgrown. Branches reached across the trail, forcing me to duck and weave. The mist seemed thicker here too, if that was possible, reducing visibility to just a few feet. But I pressed on, drawn by the distant sound of falling water. As I moved deeper into the forest, following what I thought was the trail to Rainbow Falls, something changed. The quality of the silence shifted. It wasn't just quiet, it was an absence of sound that seemed to press against my eardrums. Even my own footsteps seemed muted, as if the forest was absorbing the sound before it could echo. The trail began to feel different under my feet. What had been packed earth became softer, spongier, moss, perhaps, or decades of decomposed leaves. The trees here were older, their trunks massive and gnarled. Some had hollow spaces at their bases large enough for a person to hide in. The mist clung to everything, creating ghostly streamers that moved without any apparent breeze. I stopped to orient myself, but the fog had become so thick I could barely see the trail behind me. The sound of the waterfall, which had seemed so clear before, now came from multiple directions at once, echoing off invisible rocks and trees. My phone had no signal, not unusual for the park, but unsettling nonetheless. That's when I noticed the footprints. Not mine. These were older, partially filled with water from the morning dew. They led off the main trail into a smaller path I hadn't noticed before. Something about them made me pause. They were the right size for running shoes, but the pattern was strange, as if whoever made them had been walking backward, or dancing, or... I followed them. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else, that same compulsion that had driven me to wake Eddie, to go running in the fog, to separate from him at the intersection. The smaller path wound between trees so close together I had to turn sideways to pass through. The footprints continued, sometimes clear, sometimes barely visible, leading me deeper into a part of the forest that felt ancient, untouched. The mist began to take on shapes. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something in between. Tricks of the light and moisture, I told myself. But my heart was racing now from more than just exertion. The trail had disappeared completely. I was following only the footprints now, and even those were becoming harder to see. Then I heard it. A sound that wasn't quite voice, wasn't quite wind, wasn't quite anything I could identify. It came from ahead, from behind, from above. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. The ground under my feet felt unstable, as if I were running on water. Back at the campsite, Eddie had returned from his run to find the others just emerging from their tents. The sun had finally burned through some of the mist, revealing a beautiful summer morning. But I wasn't there. "Where's Christina?" Faith asked, looking around the campsite. "She went to see the waterfall," Eddie replied, toweling off his sweat. "Said she'd be right back." They made breakfast, the smell of bacon and eggs filling the air. Other campers were starting their days too. Children already playing by the lake, adults nursing cups of coffee. But as 11 a.m. came and went, my absence began to weigh on them. "She should be back by now," Joe said, voicing what they were all thinking. Eddie and Joe decided to search the trail to Rainbow Falls. They walked quickly at first, then began jogging, calling my name. Their voices echoed off the rocks near the waterfall, but there was no response. They searched the Lake Superior Trail and the Rainbow Falls Trail, then several smaller paths they thought I might have explored. As they searched, they noticed things that hadn't been apparent in the morning mist. Places where the trail seemed to split into paths that weren't on any map. Trees with markings that looked almost like arrows, pointing deeper into the forest. Areas where the underbrush was disturbed, but not in any pattern that made sense. By 2 p.m., panic had truly set in. They approached a park ranger, a middle-aged man named Bradley who had worked at Rainbow Falls for 15 years. His expression grew increasingly grave as they explained the situation. "How experienced is she with wilderness hiking?" he asked. "Not very," Faith admitted, tears beginning to form in her eyes. This was her first real camping trip. Bradley immediately called for additional rangers. Within an hour, a full search was underway. They started with the established trails, then expanded to the areas just off the paths. But as the afternoon wore on, it became clear that something was very wrong. There was no sign of me anywhere, no piece of clothing caught on a branch, no footprints in the mud near the streams, nothing. The Ontario Police's Regional Emergency Response Team arrived as the sun began to set. They set up a command post near White Sand Lake, stringing lights and laying out maps of the area. The professional search and rescue team brought equipment the Rangers didn't have: infrared cameras, GPS units, specialized tracking devices. The search intensified over the following days. Almost 100 personnel combed through the forest: police officers, firefighters, volunteer searchers from nearby towns. Specially trained divers searched the lakes and streams, their dark forms visible from the shore as they systematically covered every body of water in the park. The search dogs arrived on the third day. These weren't ordinary dogs, but specially trained trackers who could follow a scent trail days old. They were given pieces of my clothing from the tent, and immediately picked up my scent around the campsite and along the trail where Eddie and I had run together. But at that intersection where we had separated, something strange happened. The dogs followed my scent a short distance toward the Rainbow Falls Trail, then stopped. They circled, whined, seemed confused. It was as if my scent simply vanished at that spot. The helicopter searches revealed just how vast and impenetrable much of the forest really was. From above, searchers could see areas where the tree canopy was so thick that anything beneath would be completely invisible. The infrared cameras picked up plenty of heat signatures: deer, bears, smaller animals, but nothing human. The weather turned against them on the fourth day. Rain swept in from Lake Superior, heavy and cold. The trails turned to mud, and several searchers had to be pulled from areas that had become dangerously slippery. One man, rappelling down a cliff face to check a cave, lost his grip and fell 20 feet, his face striking rocks on the way down. He required emergency surgery and would carry the scars for the rest of his life. The search teams began studying maps differently now, looking for what they called anthropogenic corridors, natural pathways that a lost person might follow, believing they led to civilization: streams, ridgelines, even power line cuts through the forest. They developed a sophisticated profile based on lost hiker behavior, calculating that there was a 90% chance I was still within a 5-mile radius of where Eddie had last seen me. This led them to the Huiston River, a tributary that feeds into White Sand Lake. It was here that they made their first real discovery: a pair of socks, waterlogged and partially buried in silt at the bottom of a deep pool. They looked like running socks, the kind I would have worn, but the water had distorted them, making exact identification impossible. Near the same area, searchers found footprints in a mossy section of ground. The prints matched my shoe size, but the moss had preserved only the impression, not the tread pattern. It was something, but it wasn't enough. My family arrived on the 7th day, having driven non-stop from Toronto. My mother, Elizabeth, looked as if she had aged years in a week. She set up a tent on a lot that a sympathetic camper had given up, refusing to leave until I was found. Father Raul Escarp, a Catholic priest from our Filipino community, came with them, performing special masses each evening as the sun set. The volunteer search expanded to 200 people. They came from all over: experienced hikers, local residents, even politicians from nearby towns who knew the value of being seen helping. They formed long lines, walking slowly through the forest, checking every hollow log, every cave, every dense thicket where a person might have sought shelter. But as days turned to weeks, hope began to fade. The Ontario Police started using different language in their briefings. I was now a non-responsive person, meaning they no longer expected me to answer if I heard searchers calling. The aircraft were reassigned, the dogs were sent home. Only a skeleton crew of 20 officers remained, and even they seemed to be going through the motions. On August 23rd, the official search was called off. The investigation shifted from search and rescue to a criminal investigation. The police began interviewing everyone who had been in the park that weekend, checking backgrounds, looking for anyone with a history of violence. But the forest kept its secrets. Whatever had happened to me at that intersection, whatever had drawn me off the trail and into the mist, remained hidden in the dense undergrowth and ancient trees of Rainbow Falls. The park returned to normal. Families continued to camp at White Sand Lake. Runners still jogged the trails in the early morning, but those who knew the story would sometimes pause at that intersection, wondering what force had reached out from the forest and claimed me, leaving no trace except a pair of socks in a river and footprints that led nowhere. The forest remains, patient and eternal, its mysteries intact, And somewhere in those impenetrable depths, the answer to what happened on that foggy morning in August 2007 waits to be discovered. Or perhaps to claim another curious soul who wanders too far from the safety of the marked trails. This happened just 2 weeks ago, and I still cannot close my eyes without seeing his face. I am 31 years old, and I have been hiking backcountry trails since I was 19. I have encountered black bears, sudden storms, twisted ankles miles from civilization, and every manner of minor disaster the wilderness can throw at a person. None of it prepared me for what waited on that trail in northeastern Wyoming. The trip was supposed to be routine. A 4-day excursion through a moderately trafficked trail that wound through dense pine forests and rocky outcroppings. 2 days hiking into a scenic overlook. 2 days hiking back the same way. I had completed dozens of similar trips without incident. My gear was broken in and reliable. My body was conditioned. My mind was at ease as I pulled into the empty gravel lot at the trailhead that Monday morning. The parking area was completely vacant, which struck me as unusual for early June. Most trails in this region see at least moderate traffic during the summer months, but I attributed the emptiness to it being a weekday. I shouldered my pack, checked my map one final time, and started walking. The first several hours passed without anything worth noting. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked. Birds called from the canopy above. The temperature was perfect for hiking, warm enough to keep my muscles loose but cool enough to prevent excessive sweating. I made excellent time, covering ground faster than I had anticipated. By early afternoon, I calculated that I was only about 3 miles from the first designated campsite. My original plan was to bypass that site entirely and push on another 2 miles to the second camp, where I would spend my first night. The extra distance would make the following day's hike easier and put me at the overlook with plenty of daylight to enjoy the view. Everything was going according to plan. I found a comfortable spot beside the trail where a large pine tree created a natural seat among its exposed roots. My legs were beginning to feel the miles, and I decided a short break for food would restore my energy for the final push. I dropped my pack, settled against the rough bark, and pulled out a bag of trail mix. The forest around me was peaceful. Wind moved through the branches overhead, creating that gentle rushing sound that always makes me feel small in the best possible way. I was reaching into the bag for another handful, when some instinct made me look up. Across the trail, perhaps 40 feet into the tree line on the opposite side, a man was standing completely still. He was watching me, not walking, not doing anything that might explain his presence off the established path. Just standing there among the trees, his eyes fixed directly on my position. My hand froze halfway to my mouth. I have no idea how long he had been there. He could have been watching me for 30 seconds or 30 minutes. The realization that I had been observed without my knowledge sent an immediate wave of discomfort through my entire body. Every instinct I had developed over years of solo hiking began firing at once. The man raised his hand in a wave. The gesture should have been reassuring, a simple acknowledgement between two people sharing the same wilderness. But something was deeply wrong with the way he moved. His hand came up too slowly, his fingers spread too deliberately, and the motion had a mechanical quality that made my stomach turn. It was like watching someone perform an action they had only ever seen described in writing. Someone who understood the concept of a friendly wave but had never actually witnessed one in person. His face remained completely expressionless throughout the entire gesture. I stood up immediately, shoving the trail mix back into my pack without taking my eyes off him. I told myself I was overreacting. He was probably just another hiker who had stepped off trail to relieve himself or investigate something interesting. There were 100 innocent explanations for his presence, but my body refused to accept any of them. I secured my pack and started walking, moving faster than I had all day. Those final 3 miles to the first campsite were brutal. The terrain grew steeper, and my pace was too aggressive for the incline, but I could not force myself to slow down. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see him following at a distance, but the trail behind me remained empty. By the time I reached the designated camping area, nearly 2 hours had passed, and my legs were burning with exhaustion. The campsite was a small clearing with a fire ring and a flat area suitable for pitching a tent. Originally, I had planned to push through to the second site, but my earlier break had been cut short, and I desperately needed to eat something substantial. I decided to stop here long enough to prepare a proper meal before continuing. I would still make the second campsite before dark if I did not linger too long. I set my pack down and retrieved my compact propane stove. The simple routine of preparing food helped settle my nerves. I filled my small pot with water and set it over the blue flame, watching the first bubbles begin to form at the bottom. By the time the water reached a full boil, I had almost convinced myself that the man in the woods had been nothing more than a strange but harmless encounter. I poured the hot water into my pouch of freeze-dried pasta, sealed it, and set my timer, 8 minutes until it would be ready to eat. That was when I heard the footsteps. They came from the direction I had traveled, a steady rhythm of boots on packed earth. I looked up and my heart dropped into my stomach. It was him, the same man from the woods. He walked into the campsite with a wide grin stretched across his face, an expression that was clearly intended to appear friendly but achieved the opposite effect entirely. He had short black hair that looked unwashed, a patchy beard covering his jaw, and he wore a gray flannel shirt tucked into faded blue jeans. I guessed his age at somewhere between 35 and 45, though something about his face made it difficult to determine with any certainty. His eyes had a flat, empty quality that contradicted the smile pulling at his mouth. He greeted me like we were old friends, launching immediately into casual conversation about the trail conditions and the weather forecast. His voice was too loud for the setting, and he stood too close. I gave short, clipped answers to his questions, hoping he would take the hint and continue on his way. Instead, he walked directly up to where I was sitting and lowered himself onto the ground beside me, close enough that I could smell him, a sour, unwashed odor that suggested he had been in these woods for longer than a simple day hike would require. He kept talking. Questions about my gear, my route, how many days I planned to spend on the trail. I answered as briefly as possible while trying to eat my meal, but he seemed determined to stretch every response into a longer conversation. At one point, he looked at my food pouch and laughed, a harsh sound that did not match anything humorous in the situation. He called it a homeless meal and said I needed better nutrition if I was going to keep my strength up out here. Then he reached into his own backpack and pulled out a protein bar. The wrapper was already torn open, not partially eaten but definitely opened. The seal clearly broken and the wrapper peeled back to expose the bar inside. He held it out toward me, insisting that I take it. When I declined, he pushed harder, telling me I would need the energy and that he had plenty more where that came from. His smile never wavered, but his eyes remained completely dead throughout the exchange. There was an intensity behind his insistence that went far beyond simple friendliness. He wanted me to take that bar. He needed me to take it. I refused again, more firmly this time, and something shifted in his expression. Just for a moment, barely long enough to register, the smile flickered. What I saw underneath it made my blood feel cold in my veins. Then the grin was back, fixed in place like a mask, and he tucked the bar away with a shrug. He told me he would be staying at this campsite for the night so he could give it to me later when I got hungry. That single sentence changed everything. He was staying here. I would not have to camp anywhere near him. All I had to do was finish my meal and continue to the next site, and I would be rid of him. The relief was almost overwhelming. I ate the rest of my food as quickly as I could manage without appearing to rush. When I finished, I stood and announced that I needed to keep moving because a friend was waiting for me at the next campsite. It was a lie, obviously. I was hiking alone and no one was expecting me anywhere, but I wanted him to think someone would notice if I failed to arrive, that there would be questions asked and searches initiated if I did not show up. The man's smile stayed locked in place, but I watched something drain out of it as I spoke. His eyes, which had been fixed on my face with uncomfortable intensity, seemed to go even flatter than before. His whole expression became hollow. A thin performance stretched over something darker underneath. He nodded and wished me a good hike, but his voice had lost its artificial warmth. The words came out mechanical and empty. I turned and walked away, forcing myself not to run despite every instinct screaming at me to sprint down that trail as fast as my legs could carry me. I checked over my shoulder repeatedly during the first half mile, expecting to see him following, but the trail remained empty behind me. Maybe I had been wrong about him. Maybe he really was just an awkward person with poor social skills who did not understand boundaries. But my gut did not believe that, and I had learned long ago to trust my gut in the wilderness. The sun was already sinking toward the horizon when I finally reached my intended campsite. The hike had taken longer than expected, and I was thoroughly exhausted. But even as I dropped my pack beside the designated tent area, Something made me hesitate. A voice in the back of my mind urged me not to unpack yet, to wait and see before committing to this location for the night. I cannot explain it rationally. It was pure instinct, the same primal warning system that kept our ancestors alive in a world full of predators. I compromised by pulling out only what I absolutely needed, my water bottle and a small flashlight. Everything else stayed packed and ready to move at a moment's notice. I sat down on a fallen log to catch my breath and let the sweat dry on my skin. The forest was growing darker by the minute, shadows stretching longer between the trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl began its evening calls. Then I heard footsteps on the trail. My entire body went rigid. I knew before I even looked. I knew with absolute certainty who was coming down that path. He emerged from the gathering darkness with that same horrible grin plastered across his face, like someone wearing another person's smile. He walked directly toward me, his pace unhurried, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I lost my composure completely. All the fear and unease that had been building throughout the day erupted into sudden anger. I demanded to know why he was following me. I did not bother to soften my tone or pretend politeness. I wanted him to know that I was aware of what he was doing, that I was not some naive target who would accept his flimsy pretenses. He laughed at my accusation, a single sharp bark that sounded nothing like genuine amusement. Then he admitted it. He said the words clearly and without hesitation. "Yes, I am following you." His tone dripped with sarcasm, as if the idea were too absurd to take seriously. But his eyes told a different story. They never blinked. They never looked away. He started asking if I was hungry after all that walking, reaching toward his pack where that opened protein bar waited. I grabbed my bag and walked past him without another word. I did not care that the light was fading. I did not care that I had no idea where I would end up sleeping. I only knew that I could not stay anywhere near this man. I walked until my legs threatened to collapse beneath me. I passed back through the first campsite, which was empty, and continued beyond it for what I estimated to be another mile. The forest around me had become completely dark, the trail visible only in the narrow beam of my flashlight. Every sound made me flinch. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent my heart racing. Finally, I could go no further. I switched off my flashlight and stood in absolute darkness, letting my eyes adjust to the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. Then I stepped off the trail and moved into the trees. I walked perhaps 200 or 300 feet into the forest, far enough that the trail was no longer visible through the undergrowth, then stopped in a small depression between two large boulders. I set up my tent using only my sense of touch, not daring to use any light that might give away my position. I did not bother with the rain fly or the ground cloth. I simply erected the basic shelter, threw my sleeping bag inside, and crawled in with my pack beside me. I did not change clothes. I did not eat. I did not do anything except lie there in the darkness with my ears straining against the silence. Despite my terror, exhaustion eventually overtook me. I do not know how long I slept before my eyes snapped open. The night had grown completely still, that heavy silence that falls over the forest in the deepest hours of darkness. And cutting through that silence, clear and unmistakable, came the sound of footsteps. They were on the trail. I could hear leaves and small branches crunching under someone's weight, a steady rhythm that moved slowly through the forest. Moving in my direction, my body went completely frozen, every muscle locked tight as I strained to track the sound. The footsteps grew closer, louder, passing along the trail perhaps 300 feet from where I lay hidden. Then they began to fade, continuing down the path in the direction I had originally been traveling. He was looking for me. In the middle of the night, this man was walking through the pitch-black forest, searching. And for some reason I cannot explain, he had not seen my tent. Maybe I had gone far enough off trail. Maybe the darkness was too complete. Maybe God was watching over me. Whatever the reason, he passed by without stopping, and his footsteps eventually disappeared into silence. I did not sleep again that night. I lay in my tent with my eyes open, tracking every sound, prepared to run at the first indication that he had found me. The hours stretched endlessly, each minute feeling like an hour, each hour feeling like a week. When the first gray light of dawn began filtering through the forest, I felt like I had aged years in a single night. I broke camp in less than 5 minutes, stuffing everything into my pack without any attempt at organization. Then I started walking, not toward the overlook, not toward my original destination, I walked directly back the way I had come, moving as fast as the terrain would allow, desperate to reach my car and get away from these woods. The hike that had taken me an entire day to complete going in took less than 4 hours on the return. I did not stop for food. I did not stop for water. I barely stopped to catch my breath. Every time the trail curved or crested a hill, I expected to see him standing there, blocking my path, wearing that terrible smile, but he never appeared. When I finally emerged from the forest and saw my car sitting alone in the gravel lot, the relief hit me so hard that my knees nearly buckled. I threw my pack into the trunk, climbed behind the wheel, and drove away from that place without looking back. I have spent the past 2 weeks trying to make sense of what happened on that trail. I keep returning to the details that disturb me most. The way he appeared in the woods, watching me from off the trail. The robotic quality of his wave. The already opened protein bar that he was so insistent I eat. His admission that he was following me, delivered as a joke but containing something far more sinister. The footsteps passing through the forest in the middle of the night, searching. I believe I came very close to becoming a victim of something terrible out there. I believe that man had intentions he never got the opportunity to act upon. And I believe the only reason I am writing this now, instead of being reported missing, is because I trusted my instincts and ran when every warning signal in my body told me to run. I do not know who he was. I do not know what he wanted. I do not know if he is still out there on that trail, waiting for the next solo hiker to wander into his path. That last thought keeps me awake at night more than any of the others. Somewhere in those woods he might still be waiting, and the next person might not be as lucky as I was. The GPS signal died about 40 miles before I reached my older brother's place. Daniel had warned me that cellular towers didn't reach this deep into the forest, but watching that little blue dot vanish from my phone screen made my stomach tighten. I was committed now, following hand-drawn directions on crumpled notebook paper, navigating roads that grew narrower with every passing mile. Daniel had purchased the property 3 years earlier, seeking refuge from city life. The photographs he'd sent showed a charming 2-story home surrounded by towering pines. What they didn't capture was the profound isolation that settled over me as I drove deeper into those woods. The way the trees pressed closer with each turn. I pulled into his gravel driveway around 2 in the afternoon. On a Thursday in late October, Daniel was waiting on the porch with his dog Bruno, a young German Shepherd mix with intelligent eyes and a thick black and tan coat. I spent the next few hours catching up with my brother and familiarizing myself with Bruno's routine. The nearest neighbor is about 6 miles east, Daniel told me as he loaded his suitcase. The police station is 40 minutes away, but nothing's going to happen. It's quiet out here. I watched his taillights disappear down the driveway, swallowed by trees, and then it was just me and Bruno. The silence was the first thing that struck me. I had lived my entire adult life surrounded by the constant hum of traffic and urban infrastructure. Out here there was nothing, just the occasional creak of the house settling. I made dinner, fed Bruno, and then settled onto the living room couch. The fireplace cast a warm glow, and Bruno curled up beside me. I decided to enjoy the sunset by the fire pit in the backyard. For about an hour, I understood why Daniel had chosen this place. But then the sun slipped below the tree line. The darkness that descended was unlike anything I had experienced. Beyond the small circle cast by my campfire, the world ceased to exist. I could hear things moving out there, branches snapping, leaves rustling, soft footsteps on forest floor, but I couldn't see anything. Bruno's ears had perked up. He was staring into the darkness, his body rigid. He wasn't curious. He was alert, watchful, like he was tracking something specific. I extinguished the fire and hurried inside, locking the door with trembling hands. I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there had been watching us back. I turned on every light and put on a horror film. The long drive had exhausted me, and I found myself drifting in and out of consciousness. When I woke, the film had ended, replaced by a blue menu screen. But that wasn't what had pulled me from sleep. It was the absence of warmth beside me. Bruno was no longer on the couch. He was sitting by the front door in a posture I'd never seen. Spine rigid, head level, eyes locked on the wooden door as if he could see through it. I called his name. He glanced back for the briefest moment, then returned his attention to the door. I walked over and placed my hand on his back. I felt the ridge of raised fur along his spine. Something had triggered his protective instincts. I peered through the peephole. Nothing but darkness. I cracked the door open and stuck my head out. The cold air hit my face. I listened for footsteps, for breathing. Nothing. Just silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. I closed and locked the door, trying to convince myself Bruno had simply smelled a passing animal. But his ears remained up, rotating to track sounds I couldn't hear. His eyes never fully closing. Morning arrived with weak sunlight and chattering birds. The fears of the previous night seemed almost silly. I made coffee, took Bruno outside, and spent pleasant hours exploring the trails around the cabin. I didn't venture far, always keeping the roofline visible through gaps in the trees. As evening settled, Bruno began pacing between rooms, pausing at windows, sniffing at door frames. By 9 o'clock he was following me room to room, refusing to let me out of his sight, his eyes constantly darting to darkened windows. I put on another movie, trying to create normalcy, and Bruno eventually settled beside me. But his ears remained up, his body tense, and every few minutes he would lift his head and stare at some part of the house I couldn't see, listening to sounds beyond my perception. The barking came without warning. One moment I was half watching the movie, and the next Bruno was sprinting toward the back of the house with a ferocity that sent my heart slamming against my ribs. His barks were deep and aggressive, a warning, a threat. I found him in the kitchen, hackles raised, teeth bared, barking at absolutely nothing. The room was empty, but Bruno wasn't seeing what I was seeing. He was focused on something beyond the walls. I crouched beside him, speaking in low, soothing tones. "It's okay, boy. There's nothing there." But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. Dogs don't react like this to nothing. I managed to calm him, reducing his barks to a low growl rumbling in his chest. I was about to lead him back to the living room when I heard it. A hollow, deliberate tapping against the kitchen window. 3 distinct taps, evenly spaced, purposeful. The sound of knuckles against glass. Bruno erupted into barking again. I grabbed a knife from the counter and pressed myself against the wall beside the window. It was positioned high, at least 7 feet off the ground. To tap on it, someone would have to be standing on something, or they would have to be very tall. I stepped in front of the window, expecting to see a face staring back, but there was nothing. Just darkness. Whoever had been there was already gone. I decided the bedroom was more defensible. One window smaller than the others, and the door had a lock. I led Bruno down the hall, checked the window latch, and closed the door behind us. The click of the lock provided small comfort. I turned on the television and began gathering things for a shower. I was covered in cold sweat, my nerves frayed. I left Bruno on the bed and stepped into the adjacent bathroom. The water heated quickly. I stood under the spray, letting it pound against my shoulders, trying to wash away the fear burrowed in my chest. That's when I heard the thumping. 3 heavy impacts against the wall, rhythmic and deliberate. Then Bruno started barking again. I shut off the shower and pulled on clothes over wet skin. I yanked open the bathroom door. Bruno was gone. The bedroom door was standing open. The door had been locked. I had tested the handle myself. Bruno didn't have thumbs. Someone else had opened that door. I could hear Bruno barking somewhere else in the house, moving toward the front. I grabbed the flashlight and ran. I rounded the corner into the living room and saw the front door hanging wide open, cold night air pouring in. Bruno was already outside, a dark shape sprinting into the trees, his barks growing fainter. I screamed his name, but he was beyond hearing, chasing something into the depths of that terrible forest. I didn't think. I just ran, following the fading sound of Bruno's barks into darkness. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as I crashed through underbrush. Within minutes, I was completely disoriented. The cabin had disappeared behind me. The forest had gone silent. No more barking, no footsteps, just absolute silence pressing against my ears. "Bruno!" My voice cracked. "Bruno, come!" Nothing. I called again and again, sweeping my flashlight through the trees. I was about to start walking, to pick a direction and hope, when I heard rustling ahead of me. Bruno emerged from the darkness, tail tucked between his legs, ears flat against his skull, whimpering with a fear I had never heard from him. He ran straight to me and pressed against my legs, shaking violently, his eyes never leaving the direction he had come from. I grabbed his collar and ran, choosing a direction that felt right. Branches whipped my face. Thorns tore at my clothes. Because somewhere behind us, I could hear footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, keeping pace with our flight. I found the cabin by pure luck. I dragged Bruno inside, slammed the door, threw the deadbolt. Then I pushed a heavy bookshelf in front of the door and wedged chairs under every other entrance. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 attempts to dial 911. I called Daniel next. He said he would drive through the night. The police arrived 45 minutes later. They searched the property, found no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence of anyone having been there. They suggested it might have been an animal, that Bruno might have slipped out when I wasn't paying attention. I didn't argue. I knew what I had experienced. Someone had been in that house, had stood outside that window, had opened that door. But without evidence, my story sounded like paranoid ramblings. I drove to a motel an hour away. Daniel arrived the next morning and walked the property with a flashlight. He found nothing concrete, but he did notice something. A faint trail of crushed vegetation leading from the tree line to the side of the house, as if someone had been pacing there repeatedly, watching. That was 6 years ago. Bruno has grown old since then. His muzzle gray, his movements slower, but his eyes still carry that same vigilance. When I visit Daniel, Bruno always greets me with enthusiasm. Someone was stalking that house for at least 2 days. They knew when I showered, knew when the dog was separated from me, knew exactly how to enter. And when Bruno chased them into those woods, something happened. Something that scared a trained protection dog badly enough that he still flinches at sudden noises. I don't know who it was. The police never identified a suspect. But whoever they were, they're still out there. Maybe watching that house. Maybe watching somewhere else. Bruno saved my life that night. Whatever intentions that person had, they were thwarted by a dog who loved his family enough to chase danger into the darkness.
He may be old now, but to me he will always be a hero, and I thank God for him every single day.
I took the job as a ranger in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest because I needed distance from people. After 15 years working in Seattle's Urban Parks Department, I was burned out, tired of filing permits, managing budgets, mediating disputes between joggers and cyclists. When the posting came through for a remote station near the Cascades, I didn't hesitate. The salary was half what I made downtown, but the isolation felt like a promotion. The ranger station sat 3 miles up a service road from the nearest town, Trout Lake, population 800. My supervisor, a weathered man named Frank who'd worked these mountains for 32 years, gave me a 2-day orientation before disappearing back to the main office. He left me with a radio, a battered field guide to local wildlife, and a warning I didn't take seriously enough. People go missing up here, he said, not looking at me directly. We find them usually. Sometimes we don't. Keep your wits about you and don't go wandering off the marked trails after dark. There's things out here that don't show up in official reports. I smiled at what I assumed was an old ranger's attempt at spooky storytelling. I was 38 years old, practical, and believed in explanations. Bears attack, people get lost, animals starve or get injured and die. The world operated on cause and effect. That was October 15th. By March, I would understand that the wilderness doesn't operate on any logic we impose on it. The first sign came in early November, during a routine patrol along the Mirror Lake Trail. The weather had turned cold, and snow was coming in from the north. I was cataloging storm damage when I found the deer. A mule deer buck, no more than 3 years old by the size of it. It was splayed against a massive Douglas fir, positioned in a way that made my stomach turn. The animal was facing the tree, its front legs nearly vertical against the trunk, as if it had tried to climb it. Its back legs were extended, hooves still in the soft ground. The spine was broken, not snapped by a fall, but bent backward so severely that the ribs had punctured through the hide from the inside. There was no blood, no claw marks, nothing predatory about it. I radioed it into Frank, describing what I'd found. The static crackled for a long moment before his voice came back, tighter than before. Take a photo. Mark the location. Don't touch it. When I pressed him about what might cause that kind of injury, He went quiet. Could be anything out there, he finally said. Weather, terrain, animals panicking. You learn not to ask too many questions in those woods. I didn't listen to that advice, of course. I spent that night researching at the ranger station, scrolling through wildlife databases and veterinary texts. Stress-induced myopathy could cause muscle breakdown severe enough to snap bones, but that usually left evidence: torn muscles, hemorrhaging, signs of extreme exertion. This deer looked like something had grabbed it and twisted it, deliberately and with terrible force. By early December, I'd found 3 more animals. A Kafka pheasant similarly, 2 smaller creatures, maybe raccoons or badgers, too decomposed to be certain, arranged in patterns that suggested intention rather than accident. None of them bore marks I could identify. None of them made sense. I kept detailed notes. I photographed everything. I told myself I was being thorough. Internally, I was beginning to feel something that I recognized as real: grinding dread. January brought the snow in earnest. The mountains around the station transformed into something both beautiful and suffocating. Roads became impassable. Phone service became unreliable. I was effectively alone, checking in by radio twice daily with dispatch in Cougar, 15 miles away. I should have requested a transfer. Everything in me that still held on to rational thinking was sending up warning flags. But something else, curiosity, or maybe the slow erosion of my urban skepticism, kept me there. I wanted to know what was happening in these woods. The tracks appeared on January 18th, after a heavy snowfall the night before. I found them near Bear Creek Canyon, where I'd been clearing deadfall from a maintenance trail. The prints started in the snow-covered meadow and led north toward the thicker forest. They were bipedal, 2 feet only, and they covered impossible distances. Each stride was nearly 8 feet apart, and the prints themselves were roughly 16 inches long. What struck me most was their depth. The pressure points suggested something extraordinarily heavy, but the stride pattern indicated the creature was moving at speed, possibly running. There were no claw marks, no distinction between toes and heel that I could identify. Just broad, undefined impressions that could have been made by something wearing a shoe, or something with completely different foot structure than anything in the guidebooks. I followed the trail for 3 hours, my heart rate climbing with each advancement. The tracks remained pristinely visible, never wavering, moving in a straight line through terrain that should have demanded more lateral movement. No animal I knew of moved like that, so economically, so directly, so intentionally. Around mile marker 3 from where I'd started, the tracks simply stopped. In the middle of an open area, with no obstacles, no reason for deviation, they ended. There were no tracks leading away. No disturbance in the surrounding snow. It was as if whatever had made them had simply ceased to exist. I sat on a fallen log in that clearing for 20 minutes, my breathing loud inside my own head. My practical mind offered explanations. A person on snowshoes, a hiker I'd missed, someone from town out hunting, but snowshoes left different patterns, and the stride length violated everything I knew about human biomechanics. That night, I made a decision that would define the rest of my tenure. I called Frank. "I'm seeing tracks," I said without preamble. "Big ones. Not matching any animal I can identify. Not bear, not elk. I think something else is out here." The line went quiet so long I thought we'd lost connection. "How big?" Frank's voice had changed. The avuncular tone was gone. 16 inches. Maybe larger. 8-foot stride. Bipedal. Another pause. "Tomorrow at dawn, drive to the north access point at Highway 141. There's a cabin there that the service maintains. Meet me at sunrise. And Riley, don't go back to where you saw those tracks tonight. Just stay inside." I'd never told him my name was Riley. I hadn't mentioned what I did or didn't do. My hands were trembling as I set the radio down. The cabin sat isolated in a clearing that had been carefully maintained, though I'd never been directed there in my orientation. Frank was already inside when I arrived, sitting at a wooden table with 2 cups of coffee and a bottle of whiskey between them. He looked like he'd aged 5 years since October. His hands shook as he poured a measure of whiskey into each cup. "I promised myself I wouldn't tell anyone what I've seen out here," he began, not meeting my eyes. 20 years ago, I almost died because of what's in these mountains, and I decided then to keep my mouth shut. Keeps people from panicking, keeps them from looking for explanations that exist outside of reasonable science. He drank half the cup. But you've already started looking. I could see it in your voice on the radio. You're going to die out here if you don't understand what you're dealing with. What Frank told me over the next 3 hours would reshape everything I thought I knew about the forests I'd committed to protect. He described the first encounter as a younger man, 23 years old, newly hired and eager to prove himself. He'd been checking a backcountry shelter when he heard the sounds. A series of vocalizations that weren't quite howling, and weren't quite anything produced by known animals. When he investigated, he found tracks similar to what I'd discovered, 16 to 18 inches bipedal, arranged in patterns that suggested the creature had been circling the shelter. I thought it was a hoax, Frank said. Some local kids trying to scare the new ranger. But when I tracked it, the size became apparent. Whatever made those prints weighed maybe 600 pounds, maybe more. It moved through terrain I couldn't navigate. And when I found where it had been watching the shelter, there was a tree where branches were broken at approximately 7 feet up. Something was standing there, watching inside. Over the following years, Frank said, he'd found evidence of multiple entities. The tracks appeared in different locations, sometimes 5 years apart. Animal remains turned up in configurations that made no sense. Rangers would disappear on routine patrols. Some were found days later, confused and unable to explain where they'd been. Others were never found at all. What are they? I asked. Though something in me already knew the answer and recoiled from it. Frank pulled out a worn folder from his pack. Inside were photographs, some Polaroids so old the colors had faded into ghosts of themselves, some newer digital images. The pictures showed tracks, massive and disturbing. They showed tree bark stripped at impossible heights. One photograph showed what appeared to be a massive paw print, but the structure was too complex, too articulate, too wrong. There's things, Frank said carefully, that exist at the edges of established reality. Native people knew about them. They have names and languages we don't speak anymore, stories that don't translate cleanly. The government doesn't acknowledge them, because acknowledging them would require acknowledging a gap in our understanding of the natural world. You're talking about Bigfoot, I said. It sounded absurd even as I said it. Sasquatch. The North American ape that doesn't officially exist. Frank nodded. Among other things. The tracks you found. Some of them might be that. But not all. There are at least 3 different patterns I've documented. 3 different things walking these mountains. He spread more photographs across the table. Different track patterns. A hair sample, bagged and labeled, that was dark and coarse and too thick to match any animal I could name. A sketch, crude but detailed, of something that might have been a face, drawn by a ranger in 1987, who'd quit 3 weeks after filing the report. What about the animals? I asked. The deer I found. The broken backs. Frank's expression darkened. That's not Sasquatch behavior. That's something else. Something meaner. The locals call it the Dogman. But that name doesn't do justice to what it is. Taller than tall. 4-legged, sometimes 6, depending on what people have seen. Impossible face. And it kills for reasons we don't understand. Not for food, not for territory. For pleasure, maybe. For sport. I wanted to leave. I wanted to drive back to the ranger station, pack my things, and transfer back to Seattle. The fact that I didn't, the fact that I sat there and kept listening, was the moment I crossed a line I couldn't recross. Frank told me about the Wendigo next, and this time he was reading from notes written in a shaking hand, words underlined multiple times for emphasis. The Wendigo was the oldest threat, he said, the most dangerous. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't an animal that could be classified or studied. It was something that emerged from starvation and desperation and the breakdown of human civilization at its edges. It appeared when people were isolated, desperate, dying. It fed on more than flesh. I've never seen it, Frank said. 32 years and I've never actually laid eyes on it. And I thank God for that. But I've found the aftermath. I've talked to survivors, and they're all broken in the same way. They talk about hunger that exists inside their own heads. About wanting to eat things that aren't food. About losing track of what they are. The folder contained case reports dating back to the 1950s. Missing hikers. Rangers found dead with evidence of self-inflicted injury. Hunters who'd turned their weapons on their own hunting parties. A rescue team that went into the mountains to find a lost family and came back with only 2 survivors, both of them severely malnourished despite being out for less than 48 hours, both babbling incoherently. By the time I returned to the ranger station, I'd made a choice that seemed insane even to me. I would stay. I would document what Frank couldn't. I would try to understand the mechanisms behind these encounters. The practical ranger in me was dead, but the investigator had been reborn. February brought 3 separate incidents. The first happened during a routine supply run to Trout Lake. I was driving back to the station, alone on the Forest Service road, when I saw movement at the tree line. Large movement. Something that shifted the branches of the fir trees laterally, the way they would move if something massive was pushing through them. I slowed the truck and for a moment I saw it, a silhouette, roughly humanoid, standing upright beside the road approximately 150 yards away. It was too tall. The proportions were all wrong. When it turned toward the truck, I couldn't make out facial features, but I felt its attention like a physical force. I accelerated. In the rearview mirror, I saw it move, not running, but walking, at a pace that covered ground impossibly fast. I didn't stop until I reached the station. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 attempts to unlock the door. That night I found the message scratched into the exterior wall of the ranger station, on the north side where I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't been checking for damage after the windstorm. Parallel gouges in the wooden siding, each 3 inches deep, arranged in patterns that almost looked linguistic but resisted interpretation. Whatever had made them had been standing at approximately 8 feet tall. The scratches were above my head height, even on my tiptoes. The second incident came on February 14th. I was conducting maintenance on the Mirror Lake Trail when I heard the vocalization, a sound that defied categorization. It was high-pitched and low-pitched simultaneously, layered in a way that hurt my ears. It contained structures that seemed almost linguistic, and underneath it ran a frequency that I felt in my chest rather than heard with my ears. The sound came from the forest to the east, maybe half a mile away, and when it stopped, the silence afterward was absolute. No birds, no wind, no ambient forest noise, just the sound of my own breathing, which seemed obscenely loud. I radioed for backup, but by the time another ranger arrived 3 hours later, everything was normal. We found nothing. The ranger, a man named Owen who'd worked the station for 4 years, looked at me carefully when I finished describing what I'd heard. "You need to get out of here," he said quietly. "Frank warned you about this place, didn't he? I can see it in your face. He told you about the things that live here." I didn't answer. Owen nodded like I'd confirmed his suspicion. "I'm leaving," he said. "I put in my transfer request last month. I'm going down to the Columbia River Gorge, as low elevation as they can put me. Those woods, they're not right. And they know. Whatever's out there, it knows when humans are paying attention to it, it knows when they're looking, and it doesn't like it." The third incident was the worst. It was February 27th, late afternoon, when I found the remains. I was following up on an old trail that hadn't been maintained in years, clearing deadfall and checking for erosion damage. The path led through a dense section of old-growth forest, and the darkness under the canopy was nearly complete even in daylight. My flashlight beam caught movement 30 feet ahead, something dark on the forest floor. As I approached, my mind tried to process what I was seeing and kept failing. It was a human body, or what remained of one. The decomposition was too advanced to determine age or gender with certainty, but the clothing, a tattered ranger uniform, the logo still visible, suggested this had been someone official, someone working. The body was positioned face down in the ferns, and the only reason I could identify it as human was the boots still on the feet and the uniform fragments. Everything else was wrong. The spine was exposed in places where flesh had rotted away, but the vertebrae were fractured in patterns I'd never seen. The limbs were bent backward, joints hyperextended. The skull was cracked in multiple places, but not from impact from internal pressure, it looked like. The body had been broken by forces that came from the inside. I radioed it into Frank, my voice steady through some combination of shock and professional training. I didn't touch the body. I didn't approach it any closer. I stood at the edge of the clearing and waited for the response team. The remains were those of a ranger named Harrison, who'd gone missing in 19. He would have been missing for 25 years. There was no explanation for how a body could persist that long without being found, especially not on a trail that was checked regularly. The medical examiner said the remains showed signs of exposure and animal scavenging, but couldn't explain the bone fractures. He suggested multiple traumas over time, an animal attack followed by exposure followed by more scavenging. He wrote it up officially as an accident. I knew better. I resigned my position on March 15th, after 6 months of employment. My formal letter cited personal reasons and the desire to return to the lower elevations. I left the station in reasonably good condition, filed all reports, and drove away from Gifford Pinchot National Forest without looking back. But the wilderness doesn't let you forget. The things I encountered didn't exist in isolation, and they didn't stop existing just because I decided to leave. In the months after my departure, I compiled my research. I read everything I could find about cryptids and folklore, filtering through the nonsense to identify the patterns that matched my own experiences. What emerged was something that contradicted every principle I'd built my life on. The creatures existed. They existed in a space between official reality and folklore, persistent and undocumented. They weren't myths. They were animals that had learned not to be seen, or entities that existed outside the normal mechanisms of observation and classification. The dogman wasn't metaphorical. It was a predator that hunted within restricted territories and left patterns of evidence that experienced wilderness personnel could read if they knew what to look for. The Bigfoot, what Frank had called the Sasquatch without apology, was real. Not the ape man of cryptid documentaries, but something more sophisticated. It possessed intelligence. It left evidence deliberately sometimes, hiding at others. It avoided human contact when possible but maintained presence in claimed territories. It had territories. It had behaviors. It was as real as any other animal in North American wilderness. And the Wendigo. The Wendigo was perhaps the most real of all. It wasn't a single entity. It was a state. It was what happened when desperation and isolation and human vulnerability intersected in specific places. It was a transformation that began internally and expressed itself through external horror. Rangers who encountered it didn't return unchanged. They returned broken, or didn't return at all. What I understand now is that the wilderness reserves the right to be mysterious. We map it and measure it and submit it to scientific analysis, but there remain spaces in the deepest forests where the logic of the urban world doesn't apply. There are territories where the rules are different, where creatures persist outside of official existence, where the boundary between rational explanation and acknowledged mystery is deliberately maintained by forces we don't understand. The indigenous people who lived in these mountains for thousands of years knew this. They had ceremonies and taboos and stories specifically designed to navigate these realities. They understood that some places demanded respect born from genuine fear, not symbolic respect for environmental conservation. We lost that understanding. We built the ranger stations and cut the trails and filed the reports in triplicate, convinced that documentation and classification would convert mystery into manageable reality. We were wrong. I have not returned to the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. I took a position with a university environmental studies program, working with graduate students who study ecosystems from air-conditioned offices. I sleep better at lower elevations. I avoid the mountains during winter, but I remain changed. Every sound in a dark forest triggers the memory of that vocalization. Every unusual animal track reminds me of the impossible prints I followed through the snow. And sometimes on certain nights when the wind blows from the north, I hear something that makes me remember that the forest is not our space to manage. It is our space to survive in, if we're fortunate, if we remain humble. If we understand that there are things that exist in the deep woods that have no obligation to conform to our understanding of reality. The creatures are still there. The dogman maintains its territory. The Sasquatch walks the high ridges, and in the darkest places, in the deepest isolation, the Wendigo waits for the desperate and the lost. I know this because I've seen the evidence. I've read the reports that don't exist in official databases. I've spoken to other rangers who've encountered things they can't explain to their supervisors. I've compiled the patterns that emerge from 40 years of disappearances and anomalies and unexplained injuries. The mountains know their own secrets. The wise person accepts this and stays away. But I cannot stay away entirely. Sometimes I dream of those forests, of the way the light filters through the old-growth canopy, of the smell of ancient earth and growing things, and in those dreams I hear it again, that layered vocalization that exists between sound and silence, the voice of something that has lived in those mountains far longer than we have and will remain long after we're gone. The wilderness doesn't apologize. It doesn't explain itself. It simply exists, indifferent to our theories and our need for understanding, reserving certain truths for itself alone. Those of us who work in those spaces are permitted only glimpses, brief revelations that leave us changed but cautious, aware that our knowledge is incomplete, and that some mysteries are preserved not out of ignorance but out of intention. This is what I learned in 6 months as a park ranger in the Cascade Range. This is what I know to be true, and this is what I tell you now, as a warning. The forests of America are not empty. They are occupied by intelligences that predate our presence and will continue long after we're forgotten. If you venture into the deep wilderness, particularly the high mountain ranges and the old-growth forests, go with respect, go with fear, go with the understanding that you are a guest in a space that has its own rules, its own inhabitants, and its own fierce indifference to human survival. Some mysteries are preserved for a reason. I never believed in monsters until I became a park ranger. That probably sounds naive now, given what I've seen. But back then I thought the real dangers were exposure, dehydration, maybe a bear attack if you were careless. I was wrong about everything. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you understand what's out there, waiting in the spaces between the trees where the light doesn't quite reach. I worked for 8 years in the forests of northern Michigan, in a stretch of wilderness so remote that cell service was a fairy tale, and the nearest town was a 40-minute drive on unpaved roads. The park covered over 200,000 acres of dense pine, hardwood forests and swampland that hadn't changed much since the last ice age. I was 26 when I started, fresh out of college with a forestry degree and romantic notions about protecting nature. My supervisor was a man named Thomas Hewitt, a granite-faced veteran who'd worked these woods for 30 years. On my first day, he drove me to the ranger station, a weathered cabin that smelled of pine sap and old coffee, and sat me down with a gravity that should have warned me. "Matthew," he said, using my first name, though we'd just met. "There are rules here that aren't in your manual." He pulled out a hand-drawn map, covered in notations and marks in faded ink. Certain areas were circled in red. Others had symbols I didn't recognize. "Stay out of the red zones after dark," he continued. "If you hear whistling in the forest at night, do not under any circumstances whistle back. If you find a circle of stones in a clearing, leave immediately and report its location to me. Do not camp within sight of it." He paused, studying my face. "And if you ever smell rotting meat mixed with wet dog in the middle of summer, you run. You don't investigate. You don't try to be a hero. You run back to your vehicle, and you get out." I remember laughing nervously, assuming this was some kind of hazing ritual for new rangers. Thomas didn't smile. "I'm serious, son. Gabriel used to work your route. Good kid, real dedicated. He didn't follow the rules." Thomas's jaw tightened. "They found his uniform in the Blackwood Swamp, torn to pieces. Never found Gabriel. That was 3 years ago," he told me. Since then, they'd had trouble keeping rangers on the northern routes. Most quit within months. Some just stopped showing up. One ranger, a guy named Ezra, had been found wandering on Highway 41, 20 miles from his post, unable to speak. He just stared and trembled. They had to commit him. I spent my first 6 months learning the trails, the campsites, the usual ranger business. I helped lost hikers, cleaned up campsites, monitored wildlife, filed reports. It was peaceful work, and I started to think Thomas's warnings were just old forest superstitions, stories passed down to add mystery to long nights in the woods. Then came the night at Clearwater Ridge. It was late September, and I was doing a routine patrol of the northern campsites. The air had that crisp bite of approaching autumn, and the leaves were just starting to turn. I was checking on a family campsite, making sure their fire was properly contained, when their 10-year-old son, a kid named Jaden, grabbed my arm. "Mister, there's something wrong with that dog," he whispered, pointing toward the tree line. I turned to look and felt my blood go cold. About 50 yards into the forest, just visible in the dying light, was a shape. At first glance, it looked like a large dog, maybe a wolf, standing on its hind legs behind a pine tree. But it was too tall, at least 6 feet, and the proportions were wrong. The head was too large, the limbs too long, and it was watching us. "Get in the tent," I told Jaden quietly. "Tell your parents to stay inside and keep quiet." The boy didn't argue. Smart kid. I kept my eyes on the shape, reaching slowly for the radio on my belt. The thing tilted its head, and I saw eyes catch the firelight, gleaming yellow and too far apart to be a wolf's. Then it dropped to all fours and moved. Nothing that size should move that fast. It flowed between the trees like water, never making a sound. I caught glimpses of dark fur, of something that moved wrong, joints bending at angles that weren't natural. It circled the campsite, staying just inside the tree line, and I could hear it now, a low, wet breathing sound that raised the hair on my neck. I got the family into their car. The father, a man named Carter, wanted to argue about leaving their gear, but one look at my face and he just started the engine. As they drove away, I saw the thing standing at the forest edge in my flashlight beam. It was definitely not a dog, not a bear, not anything I'd learned about in school. It stood upright again, and I saw its face for just a moment. A wolf's muzzle, but wrong, stretched and almost human in its expression. Its eyes held an intelligence that made my hands shake. Then it opened its mouth, and a sound came out that I still hear in nightmares, a perfect imitation of a crying child. I ran for my truck and I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station. Thomas was there, waiting with a cup of coffee like he knew I'd come. I told him everything, my words tumbling over each other. He just nodded slowly. "Dogman," he said. "You saw the Dogman. They've been in these woods longer than we have. Usually they keep their distance, but something's got them agitated this year." "Dogman," I echoed stupidly. "Like the Michigan Dogman? That's just an urban legend, a song from the 70s. "That song was based on something," Thomas said. "Seventh year of every decade, that's when they're most active, most aggressive. We're coming up on 2027 in a few years, but they've been restless early. You did the right thing getting those people out." He refilled his coffee. "Stay armed on your patrols now. Carry the rifle, not just the bear spray. And Matthew, if you see it again, don't look it in the eyes. They take that as a challenge." I went home that night to my small rental cabin and didn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. When dawn finally came, I seriously considered quitting. But something kept me there. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness, maybe the same thing that makes people slow down to look at accidents on the highway. I needed to understand what was out there. That was my first mistake. Understanding came at a price. October brought colder weather and fewer visitors. The autumn colors peaked, drawing photographers and leaf peepers for a few weeks, then the park grew quiet. I settled into an uneasy routine, always carrying the rifle Thomas issued me, always watching the tree line. I wasn't the only ranger dealing with strange incidents. A younger ranger named Luca reported finding campsites torn apart, tents shredded from the outside in patterns that didn't match any known predator. Another ranger, Isaac, found animal carcasses arranged in deliberate patterns, drained of blood. We all started checking in more frequently on the radio. Nobody admitting we were scared, but all of us feeling it. The Dogman, I learned, was part of local Anishinaabe folklore going back centuries. Thomas introduced me to a man named Adrian from the nearby Ojibwe community, who agreed to talk to me over coffee at a diner in the closest town. "Your people call it Dogman," Adrian said, his weathered hands wrapped around his mug. "We have other names. It's a guardian, some say, or a punisher, a shapeshifter that watches the boundaries between the human world and the wild places. You weren't supposed to see it, probably. The fact that you did means the boundaries are thin right now." "Thin?" I asked. "Between worlds. Between what should be and what shouldn't be. When that happens, other things can come through too." He studied me with dark, serious eyes. "You're young. You can still get out. Find work in a city park somewhere with lights and crowds. These woods, they're getting hungry again." But I didn't leave. Looking back, I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could handle it. Maybe I just didn't want to admit to myself that the world was bigger and darker than I'd been taught. I went back to work, carried my rifle, and tried to do my job. 3 weeks after the Clearwater Ridge incident, I got a call about a missing hiker. A local named Nolan had gone into the Blackwood Swamp area 2 days earlier and hadn't returned. His truck was still at the trailhead, keys in the ignition. We organized a search party. Myself, Luca, a volunteer named Dylan, and a state police officer named Anthony. The Blackwood Swamp was one of Thomas's red zones. The area was a maze of stagnant water, dead trees, and sucking mud. Fog hung there even in bright daylight, and the trees grew twisted and close together. I'd only been in there twice, both times getting a sick feeling that made me want to leave immediately. We spread out in a grid pattern, calling Nolan's name, following what remained of the trail. The swamp swallowed sound strangely. You could shout and hear your voice die a few feet away. Around noon, Dylan radioed that he'd found something. Nolan's backpack, torn open and scattered across a small clearing. We converged on Dylan's position. The clearing was wrong from the moment I saw it. A perfect circle about 20 feet across, ringed by dead trees that all bent inward like they were bowing. In the center was a pile of stones arranged in a pattern, and scattered around it were Nolan's belongings. His food, his water bottle, his sleeping bag, all shredded methodically. "We should go," I said immediately, remembering Thomas's warning. But Anthony was already moving into the clearing, calling for Nolan. "There's blood here," he said, kneeling by the stone pile. "Recent." That's when we heard it. Footsteps in the water. Something big moving through the swamp. But the footsteps were wrong. They came in an odd rhythm. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. Like something with too many legs learning to walk. Dylan saw it first. "Oh Jesus," he whispered, backing up. "Oh Jesus Christ, what is that?" It came out of the fog like a nightmare taking shape. 8 feet tall at least, covered in dark matted fur that hung in wet clumps. But the torso was too long, stretched out like taffy, and the arms reached almost to the ground, ending in hands that were too human, with too many joints in the fingers. The head was the worst part. A wolf's skull, but massive, with eyes that glowed amber in the dim light, and a jaw that hung open too wide, showing rows of teeth that went back too far into its throat. It stood there, swaying slightly, and that smell hit us. Rotting meat mixed with wet dog. So strong it made my eyes water. The dog man. But this was different from what I'd seen at Clearwater Ridge. This was bigger, more wrong, like it was a different species or something corrupted. Anthony reached for his sidearm, but Luca grabbed his arm. "Don't," he said. "Just back away slowly. Don't look at it." We started backing up, moving as one unit, keeping our eyes on the ground. The thing followed us, moving on all fours now, its breathing a wet rattle that echoed through the swamp. It stayed about 20 feet back, pacing us. And I realized with horror that it was hurting us, pushing us away from the clearing and deeper into the swamp. "The truck's that way," Dylan whispered, pointing left. "We need to break for it." "On 3, I said, gripping my rifle. 1, 2, the thing howled, and it was the sound of a man screaming mixed with a wolf's cry, amplified until it felt like it was inside my skull. We ran. God help us. We ran like our lives depended on it. Because they did. Behind us. I could hear it crashing through the undergrowth, moving impossibly fast. Dylan tripped, went down hard in the mud. Anthony and I grabbed him, hauled him up, kept moving. The thing was getting closer. I could hear its breathing right behind us now, could smell that awful stench. Luca turned and fired his rifle blindly behind us. The shot echoed across the swamp, and the thing screamed again, but I don't think he hit it. We burst out onto the trail. Saw the trucks ahead. My lungs were burning. My legs felt like rubber, but we didn't stop. In the rearview mirror, I saw it standing on the trail behind us, rising to its full height on 2 legs. Then it dropped back down and loped back into the swamp, disappearing into the fog like it had never been there. We drove straight to the ranger station. Thomas took one look at our mud-covered, terrified faces and poured us each a shot of whiskey. We told him what happened. He just nodded, like we'd confirmed something he already knew. "It's getting worse," he said quietly. "They're not just watching anymore, they're hunting. Something's drawing them out, making them bold." He looked at me. "I'm putting the northern section off limits. We'll close the Blackwood area entirely, cite environmental concerns. But whatever's happening out there, it's not over. We never found Nolan." After a week, the official search was called off, and he was declared a missing person, presumed dead. His family held a memorial service. I went, though I couldn't tell them what I knew, that their son had wandered into something ancient and hungry, and it had taken him. That night, lying in bed, I heard whistling outside my cabin. 3 clear notes, rising and falling. I remembered Thomas's warning, never whistle back. I lay there in the dark, covers pulled up to my chin like a child, and listened to the whistling move around my cabin in a slow circle. It went on for an hour before finally fading into the distance. I didn't sleep at all. November came with early snow. The park's visitor numbers dropped to almost 0. Most of the seasonal rangers went home for the winter, leaving just a skeleton crew, myself, Thomas, Luca, and 2 others, Lincoln and Miles. The forest became a different place under snow, beautiful and pristine and utterly silent. The dogman sightings stopped. Thomas said they den up in the coldest months, sleep away the winter like bears. I wanted to believe that, wanted to think we'd have a few months of normalcy, but the forest was too quiet. Animals leave tracks in snow. You see birds, squirrels, deer. We saw nothing. The woods were empty, like everything with sense had fled. It was Lincoln who first mentioned the trees. He'd been checking on the warming huts we maintained for winter hikers when he noticed them. Massive depressions in the snow in areas where no humans had been. The prints were enormous, at least 18 inches long and 7 wide, with 5 distinct toes. They formed a trail that went for miles, through terrain too steep and rough for normal traffic. Bear prints, Thomas said when Lincoln showed him the photos. But his voice lacked conviction. In November? Lincoln countered. They should be hibernating. And bears don't have feet that big. These prints are deeper than mine, like whatever made them weighs close to 800 pounds. We followed the trail the next day, a group of 4, Thomas, Lincoln, Miles, and myself. The tracks led north into the oldest part of the forest, where the pines grew massive and close together, blocking out the sky. The snow was deep here, pristine except for that single line of prints. They were spaced far apart, indicating a stride of at least 6 feet. Whatever made them was huge and moving with purpose. 3 miles in, we found the first tree. A pine tree, maybe 60 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter, broken off about 12 feet up. Not sawed, not lightning struck. Broken, like something had grabbed it and snapped it like a twig. The top of the tree lay in the snow 50 feet away. The break was splintered, showing fresh wood. Storm damage? Miles suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. Lincoln pointed up. Trees break from wind damage at weak points. Rot spots. This one was healthy. Look at the rings. Solid all the way through. He touched the break, running his fingers over the splintered wood. Something grabbed this and twisted it until it broke. We found 5 more broken trees in the next mile, all snapped at heights between 10 and 15 feet. Between the trees, the prints continued, along with something new. Long scratches on tree trunks, gouged deep into the bark, higher than any of us could reach. Some kind of marking behavior. Territorial boundary markers, perhaps. We should turn back, I said. The sun was getting low, and the forest was growing dim. Thomas agreed. But as we turned around, Miles grabbed my arm and pointed. What's that? In a clearing ahead, barely visible in the fading light, was a structure. It looked almost like a teepee or lean-to, but massive, made from pine branches and small trees stacked against each other. It had to be 20 feet tall, and the entrance was a dark opening that led into shadow. Could be an old hunting shelter, Thomas said, but he didn't move toward it. We should have left. Every instinct I had was screaming to get out of there. But Lincoln was already moving forward, camera in hand, documenting everything. Professional curiosity overriding survival instinct. Miles followed him, and Thomas and I exchanged a look before we followed too, not wanting to split up. The closer we got, the more wrong it seemed. The structure was too deliberate, too carefully made. And the smell, pine sap and musk and something else. Something wild and pungent that made my eyes water. Around the entrance were bones, picked clean and white against the snow. Deer skulls, bird bones, and other things I couldn't identify. Lincoln was peering into the dark entrance with his flashlight. There's something in here, looks like. The roar came from behind us. I'd heard bears roar before, heard lions at the zoo, but this was different. It started low, rumbling like thunder, then rose to a shriek that hurt my ears and seemed to shake the very ground. We spun around. It stood at the edge of the clearing, massive and impossible, 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark reddish-brown hair. The build was ape-like, but more human. Broad shoulders, long arms, but standing fully upright. The face was a nightmare, flat and dark, with a prominent brow ridge, a broad nose, and eyes that glittered with intelligence and rage. Bigfoot, Sasquatch. The thing that wasn't supposed to exist. It roared again, and I could see its teeth, large and yellowed. Then it charged. Not lumbering, not slow. It crossed the clearing in seconds, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something its size. We scattered. Thomas and I went left. Lincoln and Miles went right, pure panic driving us. I ran blindly through the trees, Thomas right behind me. And behind us I could hear crashing, branches breaking, that awful roaring. The thing was following us, hunting us. My lungs burned in the cold air. My legs pumped mechanically, driven by pure terror. The stream. Thomas gasped. Cross the stream. I saw it ahead, a partially frozen creek. We jumped, landed hard on the other side, kept running. Behind us, the crashing stopped. I risked a glance back and saw it standing at the stream's edge, watching us. It didn't cross. Instead, it stood there, chest heaving, and let out one more roar before turning and loping back the way it had come. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck, parked on an access road a mile away. Miles and Lincoln were already there, pale and shaking. None of us spoke. We just got in and drove back to the station. That night, Thomas broke out the bourbon and we drank in silence, trying to process what we'd seen. Native people have been talking about them for centuries, he finally said. The Ojibwe call them the Gitchianami Bizul, the great mystery creature. Most tribes have a name for them. They're territorial, usually avoid humans, but we got too close to that shelter. Probably a winter den or food cache. We need to report this, Miles said. Report what? Thomas shot back. That we saw Bigfoot. They'll pull our funding, shut down the park, or worse, bring in every cryptid hunter and reality TV crew in the country. These things deserve to be left alone. We'll mark that area as off-limits, say it's unstable terrain. Nobody goes north of Black Pine Ridge. That's final. We agreed. Though I don't think any of us felt good about the lie. But what else could we do? Who would believe us? And maybe Thomas was right. Maybe these things, whatever they were, deserved to live undisturbed in their forest. But it nagged at me, the pattern I was seeing. Dogman, Bigfoot, what else was out there? And why now? Why were all these things, creatures from legend and folklore, suddenly so active, so aggressive? I was about to find out, and I would give anything to go back to not knowing. December brought a cold snap that dropped temperatures to 20 below zero. The park was officially closed to camping, though we still maintained the roads and warming huts for day visitors and snowmobilers. The work was mostly solitary now, long patrols checking equipment, clearing branches from roads, monitoring for illegal activity. I should have been relieved. Fewer visitors meant fewer people at risk, but the forest felt wrong. The silence had deepened into something oppressive, suffocating. On clear days, I swear I could feel eyes watching from the tree line. At night, alone in my cabin, I heard sounds I couldn't explain. Scratching on the walls, footsteps on my roof, whispers in languages I didn't understand. Thomas noticed the change in me. You should take some time off, he said one morning. Go visit family for Christmas. Get out of these woods for a while. But I couldn't leave. Something held me there. A morbid fascination, maybe, or a sense of responsibility. These were my woods to protect, even if I didn't understand what they held. It was Elias, one of our seasonal workers who'd stayed on for winter maintenance, who first mentioned the smell. He'd been clearing a fallen tree from the access road to Lake Winnipeg when he noticed it. Rotting meat, strong and stomach-turning, but wrong somehow. Not like a dead animal, he said, but like something that was rotten while still alive. I went with him to check it out, bringing Caleb, another maintenance worker, along. The smell hit us a quarter-mile from the lake, so strong it made me gag. It reminded me of the Dogman, but worse, mixed with something chemical and wrong. We found the source at the lake's edge, a deer carcass, or what remained of one. It had been torn apart with incredible violence, pieces scattered across the frozen shore, but it wasn't the normal work of predators. The bones were cracked open and the marrow scraped out. Parts of the deer were missing entirely, not eaten but taken. What the hell did this? Caleb asked, his voice muffled by the scarf he'd pulled over his nose and mouth. I didn't have an answer. We took photos and called it in, but Thomas just told us to bag the remains and dispose of them. Some predator, probably starving, got desperate, he said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. 2 days later, a snowmobiler named Christopher reported seeing something on the trail near Lake Winnipeg. Like a person, he said, but too tall, too thin. It was standing in the trees, just watching me. When I stopped to look, it moved deeper into the forest, but the way it moved, man, it wasn't right. Like it was gliding, not walking. We dismissed it. People see things in the woods, especially in winter when the light plays tricks. But then Christopher didn't show up for his shift at the gas station in town. They found his snowmobile abandoned on the trail, still running, his helmet on the seat. No tracks leading away. He was just gone. That night, Thomas called a meeting. Myself, Luca, Lincoln, Miles, and a few others. His face was grim. I didn't want to believe it, he started. I've worked these woods for 30 years, seen things I can't explain, But I told myself it was just natural phenomena, just wildlife behaving unusually. But something's changed. Something's woken up and it's hungry. He spread out a map, marked with incidents going back months. Missing hikers, livestock killed on nearby farms, unusual tracks, strange sightings. They formed a pattern, a rough circle centered on a remote area called the Devil's Throat, a deep ravine in the oldest part of the forest. There are stories, Thomas continued. Ojibwe legends about this area, why it's called the Devil's Throat. They say something lives there, something ancient and evil. They call it Wendigo, or by other names. A spirit of winter and hunger that consumes everything. It was supposed to be just a story, a way to explain why people went missing in harsh winters. But I think there's something there, something real. You're talking about the Wendigo, Lincoln said flatly. The cannibal spirit. I'm talking about something that's taking people. Something that's getting more active as winter gets colder. Call it what you want. Thomas looked at each of us. I'm closing the northern section entirely. Nobody goes in. I don't care if we have equipment up there. I don't care if someone reports seeing smoke or hearing cries for help. Nobody goes in. We agreed. But I could see the doubt on some faces. This was beyond weird animal behavior now. We were talking about something supernatural. Something from folklore. It was easier to believe in Bigfoot, a flesh and blood creature, than in spirits and monsters. But I'd seen the dog man. I'd seen Bigfoot, and I'd felt the wrongness in these woods growing day by day. If Thomas said there was something worse out there, I believed him. 3 days before Christmas, we got a distress call from a family stranded on the North Road. Their car had broken down, and they were freezing. The location was right at the edge of Thomas's exclusion zone. He argued against going in, but it was a family with children. We couldn't leave them. I went with Luca and a ranger named Joshua. We took the heavy truck with chains on the tires, loaded with survival gear. The family had called from a cell phone. A miracle they got any signal at all. We had their location, about 6 miles in on a fire road. The sun was setting as we found them. A father named Nathan, his wife and their 2 kids, huddled in their sedan. They were cold but okay. We got them into our truck, got the heat running, gave them blankets and hot coffee from a thermos. Nathan was apologetic, explaining their GPS had led them astray, and then their transmission had died. We should get you out of here, I said, watching the darkness gather between the trees. That smell was there again, faint but distinct. Rot and chemical wrongness. I told them not to stop here. Nathan's wife said. There was something in the road earlier, something big. It just stood there staring at us before it moved off into the trees. What did it look like? Luca asked, his voice tight. Like a person, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, with skin like it was stretched too tight over bones. She shuddered. And the face, God, the face was all sunken in except the mouth. The mouth was too big. Luca and I exchanged a look. We need to leave now, I said. Joshua was already behind the wheel, engine running. But when he put it in gear, nothing happened. The transmission was dead. He tried again. The engine revving, but the truck not moving. We're stuck, he said, voice edged with panic. I grabbed the radio, called for backup. Thomas's voice crackled back. Copy that, sending the second truck. ETA 40 minutes. Sit tight, 40 minutes. In the dark, 6 miles deep in the woods, with something out there. I told everyone to stay calm. Keep the doors locked, lights on. We'd be fine. But I didn't believe it. And looking at Luca's face, neither did he. The smell got stronger. Through the truck's windows, I could see the darkness deepening, night coming fast. And then I saw it move between the trees. A shadow, impossibly tall and thin, gliding silently through the forest. It circled our truck, staying just outside the range of our lights. The kids started crying. Nathan held them, trying to be brave, but his hands were shaking. Joshua had his pistol out, the metal gleaming in the dashboard lights. Luca was praying quietly in Spanish, the same phrases over and over. The thing came closer, and in the headlights I finally saw it clearly. 7 feet tall at least, skeletal thin, covered in matted hair and dirt. The skin was gray-white, pulled tight over bones that jutted at wrong angles. The face was a skull with leathery skin stretched across it, eyes sunken deep into the sockets and glowing with a yellowish light. And the mouth, God, The mouth was filled with broken teeth and stretched into a permanent grimace of hunger. It pressed against the driver's side window, and Joshua screamed. The glass fogged with its breath, and I could see its mouth working, opening and closing. A sound came from it, a voice but distorted, like someone speaking through water. Hungry, so hungry, let me in, please. Don't look at it, I said. Everyone look away. Don't make eye contact. But it was circling now, looking in each window, that terrible voice pleading and demanding. The kids were screaming. Nathan was shouting. Joshua was praying. The thing's fingers scraped against the glass, impossibly long and tipped with black nails. Then headlights appeared on the road behind us. The second truck, Lincoln and Miles coming to rescue us. The creature turned toward the approaching lights and let out a shriek that shattered our driver's side mirror. Then it moved, faster than anything that size should be able to move, and vanished into the forest. We didn't waste time. Miles pulled up, got a tow cable attached to our truck, and dragged us out of there. The whole time I kept watching the trees, seeing shadows move, shapes that might have been branches or might have been something else. We didn't breathe easy until we were back at the station. Doors locked, lights blazing. Thomas looked at our faces and just nodded. "You saw it," he said. "It wasn't a question. The Wendigo. Now you understand." I understood. I understood that the world was far darker and stranger than I'd ever imagined. And I understood that my time in these woods was running out. After the incident with the Wendigo, I requested a transfer. Thomas approved it immediately. No questions asked. "You've done well," he said. "Better than most. You survived, and that's more than many can say." But my transfer wouldn't go through until January. That meant 2 more weeks in those haunted woods. 2 weeks of night shifts and empty trails, and the constant feeling of being watched. I counted down the days like a prisoner marking time. The park was officially closed now, but we still had to maintain a presence, check on the buildings, make sure no squatters or vandals moved in. Thomas assigned me to daytime patrols only, no overnights. He was trying to keep me safe, I knew. But safety was relative when you worked in a place where monsters walked. Christmas came and went. I spent it alone in my cabin. Door barricaded, rifle loaded and within reach. I heard footsteps on my roof that night, heard scratching at my windows, heard voices calling my name in tones that were almost but not quite human. I didn't sleep. I just sat in my chair with the rifle across my lap and waited for dawn. On December 28th, Thomas came to me with a problem. We had equipment at one of the northern warming huts that needed to be retrieved before the new year. Communications equipment, heaters, supplies. It was valuable gear, and leaving it might mean theft. The hut was in the exclusion zone, but it was daylight, and it would be a quick in and out. "I can't ask anyone else," Thomas said. "After what happened, the others are at their breaking point. But I need someone I trust. Someone who knows what's out there, and will be careful." I should have said no. I should have told him the equipment wasn't worth the risk. But I'd worked with Thomas for 8 years. He'd kept me alive, taught me everything. I owed him. "I'll go," I said. "But I want backup close by. Someone at the access road, ready to come in if I radio." He agreed. We planned it carefully. I'd take the snowmobile in, grab the gear, be back within 2 hours. Luca would wait at the access road with the truck. Daylight operation, simple and quick. It should have been fine. I set out at 10 in the morning. Winter sun bright on the snow. The warming hut was 5 miles in. An easy run on the snowmobile. The forest was beautiful in a stark way. Trees heavy with snow. Everything silent and clean. I tried not to think about what might be watching from those trees. I reached the hut without incident. It was a small log structure. Just one room with a wood stove and some bunks for emergency shelter. I loaded the gear into my sled, working quickly, wanting to be gone. As I worked, I noticed something. Tracks in the snow around the hut. Large tracks, different types. The massive prints of Bigfoot, the strange 3-toed prints of something else, and something new. Human footprints, but wrong, too big, with the toes spread too wide. They converged on the hut, circled it, then led away into the forest. All of them together, like they'd been meeting here, gathering. The thought made my blood run cold. These creatures, these things from folklore, working together? I was pulling the last piece of equipment onto the sled when I heard it, whistling. 3 notes, clear and pure in the cold air, coming from the forest to the north. I froze, remembering Thomas's warning from years ago, "Don't whistle back." But this time I didn't need to whistle. The sound was moving closer, and with it came others. The wet breathing of the dogman, the heavy footfalls of Bigfoot, and something else, a clicking sound like bones rattling together. I ran for the snowmobile, engine already running. As I mounted it, they came out of the trees. All of them. The dogman on my left, bigger than I'd ever seen it, maybe 7 feet tall on its hind legs. Bigfoot to my right, its reddish fur frosted with snow, lips pulled back in a snarl, and ahead, blocking the trail, the Wendigo. In daylight it was even worse, the gray skin mottled with frostbite, the jutting bones visible beneath torn flesh, the eyes burning with endless hunger. I gunned the engine, turning hard left, trying to break through between the dogman and the trees. But they moved to intercept. The dogman dropped to all fours and charged. Bigfoot roared and followed. The Wendigo glided forward impossibly fast. I zigzagged, dodging between trees, the snowmobile's engine screaming. Behind me I could hear them following, crashing through the undergrowth. The dogman was gaining, running alongside me just outside my peripheral vision. I could see it in flashes, a dark shape moving with terrible speed. Ahead was a fallen log across the trail. I had no choice. I gunned it, hit the log, and went airborne. The snowmobile landed hard on the other side, nearly throwing me off. I wrestled it straight, kept going, didn't look back. The trail opened up, and I poured on speed. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit faded. I risked a glance back and saw them standing at the fallen log, not following. They just watched as I escaped, and I realized with horror that they'd been hurting me, pushing me this direction for a reason. I topped a rise and saw why. The trail ahead ended in a cliff edge, hidden by snow and shadow. I was going too fast, couldn't stop in time. I hit the brakes, tried to turn, but the snowmobile skidded on ice. I was going over. At the last second I jumped. I hit the snow hard, rolled, felt something in my shoulder tear with a white-hot flash of pain. The snowmobile went over the edge and I heard it crash far below. I lay in the snow, gasping, watching the tree line. They were there, all 3 of them, standing side by side at the edge of the forest, watching me. The dogman tilted its head. Bigfoot beat its chest once, a dull thud that echoed across the ravine. The Wendigo opened its mouth, and that voice came out, "Leave. Never return." Then they turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing like smoke. I lay there shaking, pain shooting through my shoulder, trying to process what had happened. They'd let me go. They could have killed me, but they'd chosen not to. Instead, they'd given me a message, "Leave and don't come back." I triggered my emergency beacon. Luca found me an hour later, got me to the hospital. Dislocated shoulder, some bruised ribs, minor frostbite on my fingers. I'd live, but I was done with those woods. I told Thomas what happened, leaving nothing out. He listened without interrupting, then nodded slowly. "They're not random," he said. "They're not mindless monsters. They're intelligent, organized. They're defending their territory, their hunting grounds, and they're giving us a warning. We've pushed too far into their world, disturbed too much." "What do we do?" I asked. "We leave them alone," Thomas said. "We expand the exclusion zones, close more of the northern sections, and we don't ask questions about what's out there. It's their forest. It always has been. We're just tenants, and bad ones at that." My transfer came through on January 3rd. I said goodbye to Thomas, to Luca, to the others who'd survived. I packed my cabin, took one last look at those dark woods, and drove away. I transferred to a small state park in Pennsylvania. Gentle rolling hills and deciduous forests, no wilderness, lots of visitors. Safe, but I still hear them at night sometimes, in my dreams. The whistling of the dogman, the roar of Bigfoot, the hungry whispers of the Wendigo. They're out there still, in the deep places, in the wild places where the maps have empty spaces, and the trails lead nowhere. And they're watching, waiting, protecting their territory from a species that's forgotten that we're not alone on this planet, that we never were. I don't tell people what I saw. They wouldn't believe me anyway. But sometimes I look at maps of America, at the vast stretches of national forest and wilderness, and I wonder how many of them are out there, how many legends walk beneath those trees, how many monsters are real, And I remember Thomas's words from my first day. There are rules here that aren't in your manual. He was right. There are things in the American wilderness that predate us, that exist outside our understanding of nature and reality. Things that our ancestors knew and feared and built folklore around to explain the unexplainable. Dogman, Bigfoot, Wendigo, they're real, all of them. And if you're smart, if you value your life, you'll stay out of their woods. Because they're not our woods. They never were. We just borrowed them for a little while, and the rent is coming due. This is my testimony, my warning. I worked as a ranger for 8 years in the forests of northern Michigan. I saw things that shouldn't exist, and I'm one of the lucky ones. I got out alive. If you go into the deep woods, follow the rules. Don't whistle at night. Don't investigate strange sounds. Don't approach stone circles and clearings. And if you smell rotting meat mixed with wet dog, if you see something too tall and too thin watching from the trees, if you hear footsteps that don't sound quite right, you run. You run and you don't stop and you don't look back. Because out there, in the spaces between the trees where the light doesn't quite reach, they're waiting. And they're always hungry.